So, good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you here to this. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I'm hearing myself double. I'm very sorry. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to this online live event. Um, the title of this live event is actually The Age of Disruption, Nigeria-US Relations in a Changing World. And this is actually the first time we are hosting such an online live event, both on LinkedIn and on YouTube. That's why please be tolerant with us and bear with us if there's some technical hiccups, but it seems to be all working out fine. My name is Simon Ilse. I'm the head of the Global Unit for Human Security of Heinrich-Böll Foundation based out of Vienna. We are building this unit since the August of 2023 as a development and reinforcement of our foreign and security policy work beyond both regional and thematic areas, regional in terms of that we are looking at beyond Western and European perspectives, especially looking at perspectives from a global majority, global South countries, and thematically because we are looking beyond a security understanding of military security and let's say conventional and more traditional security frameworks, but look at it as an extended understanding of human security that really puts communities and individuals in the frontier of security policy programming. So I'm very, very happy to have here with me Chris Ngwodo, all the way from Abuja in Nigeria. Chris is the director of the Office for Strategic Preparedness and Resilience, which is located at the Vice Presidency of Nigeria. And he is really a dear friend and a great analyst and policy thinker from Nigeria that has been our guest at the Foreign Policy Conference in Berlin last year. And he has written an extensive analytical background paper called The Age of Disruption in January of this year, analyzing potential implications of the Trump presidency for US, Nigerian, but also beyond that, global and geopolitical dynamics. And yeah, our aim for this small little conversational talk of an hour is to dig deeper into his paper and to discuss it, what it really means for Nigeria, but also for Nigerian European relationships and the multilateral geopolitical order that we're at the same time seeing under very dynamic changes. So welcome, Chris. It's really my pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And yeah, and I would say we start right off actually by, if you would be so kind. I mean, your paper, we will share it afterwards, of course, at the on the event page on both LinkedIn and link it up also on YouTube. It's a 60-page brief with very extensive topics covered, all the way from the spending cuts, foreign aid changes to countering China. And Republican perceptions of Nigeria. So a very vast analysis. I would just like us to basically jump right in, for you to maybe highlight some of the key facts of your paper, what motivated it, and what would you say are the takeaway messages, and then we'll kickstart the conversation from there, if that's okay. Thank you, Chris, for being here.
Sure. Thank you, Simon. The paper, The Age of Disruption, was really motivated by a desire to sort of lay out what the next 4 years hold, what the factors or the portents of a second Trump presidency would be for Nigeria-US relations. That was really what it was about. Now, of course, this was a unique situation in that we had already had a first-term presidency for President Trump. So we had a lot of background material to work with. But after 4 years out of office, him coming back, it held a lot of both promise and peril, if you will. And we were interested in understanding what that meant for us as a country, and then from our perspective, what it meant for the wider world. So, I mean, there are a few highlights, some of which you've mentioned. I think the most obvious was obviously the cuts in foreign aid, but not just the cut in foreign aid, the reorientation of the character of foreign aid development assistance in the United States, where we are seeing much more emphasis on strategic weaponization of aid, or I should say strategic instrumentalization of development assistance, and a much more transactional approach to providing development assistance. So this is a departure from what one might call the more humanitarian orientation of development assistance that had been prevalent in the previous decades. Secondly, we see a new Trump taking office at a time where there is a departure from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And that departure is symbolized by the ascendancy of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In January, Nigeria became a partner, was admitted into partnership status. Of course, in the prelude to his inauguration, President-elect Trump at the time had spoken of very strongly against any possibility of de-dollarization being pursued by the BRICS. And clearly, President Trump is interested in maintaining US ascendancy, or I should say geostrategic primacy of the US, and he sees the BRICS as a potential counterweight to that aspiration. So that is something that also raises a lot of interest here. Very specifically, of course, we recognize that China, being perhaps the most outstanding or the most significant symbol of an emerging world order, also stands out. Obviously, it's been identified as an adversary, a very particular adversary by the US. Now, for us, we're looking at that in one way, really, or in two ways. First, what does this mean in terms of great power rivalry in our time? Are we looking at the onset of a new Cold War? Secondly, China is Nigeria's biggest trading partner. And in point of fact, Nigeria actually has very good relations with both the United States and China. So now that sort of puts us in the middle and challenges us to navigate this complex terrain. And I think the last highlight that I would point out would be the international religious freedom agenda of the new party, of the Republicans who are now the ruling party in the United States. Last time during the Trump presidency, Nigeria was classified as a country of concern, essentially meaning that it was a country in which religious minorities were facing systematic persecution by a Muslim-dominated government or a Muslim government. During the Biden years, that classification was eased. But now we recognize and we do assess and anticipate that there are elements within the Trump administration that will be pushing for the reclassification of Nigeria as a country of particular concern, and also cite issues of religious freedom. I should say, immediately, since we're talking about it right now, that narrative is a misrepresentation of the very complex issues in Nigeria. But nevertheless, this is something that I think will come up in this second-term presidency of Trump.
Thanks a lot, Chris, for kicking us off. Yeah, I think this last point, I mean, we will dig deeper into each of the points you mentioned, but that point about religious freedom as one determining frame for the U.S. Foreign policy with regards to Nigeria and probably also other countries is, I think, as you write, mostly also motivated by this idea that Christian minorities are being persecuted in Nigeria, and that a lot of the electorate of Trump is basically far right evangelical. He has a big base there, and for them it's really important to kind of make these points. We've seen that in other countries during the first presidency of Trump, especially in Africa. And I think that's a very good point to be looking after. And yeah, in general, I just wanted to ask you, what has changed in between you basically finishing the paper and publishing it in January, and now until now, mid-March 25? Basically, it's not a long time, but a lot has happened since. We have seen now, we've seen actually the first how much the first 6 weeks basically of the Trump presidency, a bit more, and very bold actions, very strong executive orders raining down on the Americans, but of course the whole world. So first of all, again, congratulations actually to having such a foresight in your paper, because I think you're actually analyzing and kind of predict a lot of things that have already happened already in January, by having a very close and deep reading of the first Trump administration. But still, I wanted to ask you what has changed since the publication for you, and what has surprised you, what hasn't surprised you, basically.
Well, first, thank you very much for your kind words, Simon. I am honestly, not much has changed. I think we released this paper before the inauguration, before the Trump inauguration. So it's been a few months since then. Not much has changed in terms of what we anticipated. I've been a bit surprised about how serious they seem to be about the whole issue with Canada. I think that's a bit of a surprise for me. I didn't think that it was something that they would pursue that stridently. Canada, Mexico, being that the US, Canada, and Mexico are part of the North American Free Trade Association. And of course, US and Canada have a very long-standing close relationship. I've been a bit surprised by how aggressively, they've gone in that direction and asserting themselves in that direction, whether it's to say they want Canada to become a state in the US, or, however else they have framed it. I've been a bit surprised by that. But I think for the other issues, no, I've not been. I think they've done pretty much what we expect them, or what we expected them to do.
Okay, yeah. One thing that I kind of looked at in your paper, I think it's quite in the beginning, where you basically say that the Trump presidency will most likely look at Russia and China both, as geopolitical rivals, and try to constrain their influence, and might even do that by strengthening NATO. When we're now seeing these fallouts with Zelensky, and also his really clear walking back from the aid to Ukraine, it sometimes looks even as if they have completely changed camps, and basically to a certain extent represent or bolster the Russian interest in when it comes to the Russian-Ukrainian war. But for sure, but I think I completely agree with you that there will be a focus more on East Asia and on China as the main rival. But of course, this war has been quite determined in international relations in the last few years. So wanted to just double check with you if that is something that where you see things are moving quicker than you thought, or are also going to have an influence, a potential influence on Africa, on West Africa especially.
Yes, well, I think as far as Ukraine goes, I think the Trump administration and before that, his supporters within the Republican Party had made it clear that they considered the conflict in Ukraine basically almost to be a strategic distraction from the business of confronting China. They believe that China is the real adversary, the true adversary, the most formidable contemporarily that the United States faces. And they believed that committing so many resources, so much in terms of resources to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian conflict, was simply creating two fronts on which the United States could not really effectively fight. I think that they have made a calculation that Ukraine is a lesser strategic objective than confronting China or constraining China. And they want a situation where they can bring some kind of closure to that situation and then be able to focus all their attention on China, on the business of confronting China. I think that is the calculation that they have made. Now, in the process of doing that, what they've also tried to do is to force European nations to ramp up their defense spendings. Of course, as I argue in the paper, this is not altruistic in and of itself. American defense manufacturers would still be the ultimate beneficiaries where the NATO countries of Europe to increase their spending on defense. So most of the weaponry would most likely be provided by American defense manufacturers. So there is, again, a strategic and transactional objective there. But I think what Trump has made very clear is that the Europeans can no longer depend on a US-led defense umbrella, particularly in this instance. If it comes to confronting Russia over the Ukraine, that is very unlikely. And I did assess that in any settlement that would emerge, Russia would most likely keep the territories that it has already seized militarily on the ground. The comments we've seen from US officials suggest that they are not much interested in changing anything that has been militarily won. The facts on the ground, in military terms, they will not change that. So what we've heard instead is the proposition about a mineral resource, some kind of mineral resource deal, which in the Trump administration's view would give them a commercial stake and a much stronger incentive, as it were, to remain in Ukraine and have some kind of presence in Ukraine. So I think that in a nutshell, what we're seeing is a pivot from Europe on the part of the US to confronting the country that it sees as its most prominent and most formidable adversary, which is China. And so I think events in the Indo-Pacific will become much more significant to the US than has previously been the case.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. Let me just quickly do a little disclaimer here for our audience. So wherever you are on LinkedIn or YouTube, you can always ask questions. Please use the chat or the comment function, and my colleagues will be able to transfer the questions then to us. We can actually really keep this quite conversational. So whenever questions come in, we'll try to pull them, and I'll try to hand them to you, Chris, then. So just continuing on that thought, where does this leave Nigeria as the most populous African nation? Also, I think the fourth biggest economy on the African continent, and really an emerging middle power, I would say, that of course has to find its way, has to find its role and place in this what some people refer to international disorder or emerging multipolar worlds. I think in the very end of your paper, you kind of conclude with saying that Nigeria has had a non-alignment tradition and has to kind of broker and balance its way between the US and China also, because you have strong ties to both of them. Yeah, just wanted to ask you about how you think this new situation will play out for Nigeria.
Well, I think currently our government's position is that Nigeria's foreign policy posture is defined by strategic autonomy. And that is consistent with our own foreign policy traditions going back several decades. During the Cold War, we were one of the prime members of the non-aligned movement. And we recognized at the time that a bipolar world with all its rivalries would not necessarily lead to any sort of sustainable global peace. Now we find ourselves in a somewhat similar situation, particularly now that you have a multipolar world order emerging. But you also have, of course, the US and China as the two dominant powers of the age. And these are two countries with which we have very strong relations, with which we've had very good relations over the years. Nigeria, I mean, among other things, China is our largest trading partner. We even have the coincidence of sharing October 1st as our National Day. With the US, our relationship has always been a very strong one. Our first president was educated in the United States, and a lot of his ideas at the time, left of center democratic ideas were actually formed or forged in the American political space. These were ideas of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt at the time. So the ideas of the Great Society, of a strong welfare state and all of that, those were things that he carried home with him. So both of these countries loom large in the Nigerian imagination. And our current posture is to not tip the scales one way or the other. It is to navigate our own interests, essentially on a case-by-case basis. Our national interests will remain paramount in our own consideration. But we do not want a situation where we're fueling the conflictual basis of a Cold War between the US and China. So really, it is really, as I said, one of strategic autonomy. It is what the Tinubu administration is committed to. And it's about, as it were, benefiting from the best of both worlds and keeping the peace. For us, the second effect would be closer home in West Africa, where traditionally Nigeria has been a stabilizing force. And we see that in recent years in West Africa and the Sahel, there's been much more tendency towards destabilization. So I think that one of the things that we're actively working on is how we can continue to be a stabilizing force and bring some peace and stability to the troubled countries of the Central Sahel in particular.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. That of course alludes also to the ECOWAS grouping of states of West Africa, in which of course Nigeria plays an important role, and which is of course in a difficult situation since there were I think two of the military basically regimes now in two of the countries declared that they wanted to exit ECOWAS, and we're not anymore also aligned in let's say common conception of security in the region. So do you think that will actually leave you basically more to your own, basically that Nigeria will have to assume even more responsibility in the region, fighting extremism and terrorism in these areas, or is that something where you're also looking for different partnerships, other alliances, since the US seems to be very much more interested in this whole religious freedom question, and not so much basically a regional security stabilization effort.
Yes, I think that where we are at right now is a situation in which we have to explore all our options. I mean, even in the context of ECOWAS, Nigeria had always borne the majority, or borne much of the burden, the greater portion of the burden in terms of stabilizing the region. What the departure of the Sahelian countries, Mali, Burkina, and Niger has done is potentially to disrupt collective security arrangements, such as the multinational joint task force, which operates in the Lake Chad area. But regardless, I think Nigeria's posture, and that of ECOWAS, to be fair, has been that there remains an open door for the AES to rejoin us. And even if they are not going to rejoin us in the immediate, there still remains a security situation that requires urgent and immediate collaboration between these two blocks of nations. It's clear the AES cannot solve the problem that it has alone, and neither can ECOWAS. So there will be need for us to collaborate on security issues in the Sahel, while continuing to build a path towards a rapprochement and eventually, ultimately, a reunion with the Sahelian countries.
Thank you, Chris. That sounds like a good vision. There's actually a few first questions coming in. I'm gonna hand them over to you. So, Siavash is asking, what is the actual impact of the Trump presidency, the unprecedented funding cuts from the US, and the European refocus on traditional security frameworks and military spending on the pursuit of human security in Nigeria and the West African region, more specifically in terms of addressing root causes of conflicts and insecurity? That is, of course, kind of connects directly to your work at the office for strategic preparedness, I would say. Would you want to directly answer to that, or do you want me to? Yeah, I think that's the only question for now.
Okay. Yeah, the funding cuts from the United States have definitely had an impact. I mean, I think the 3 or 4 core areas you can think of: healthcare. It has impacted healthcare. It has impacted issues around women's empowerment, gender empowerment. It has potentially would impact climate financing as well, funding for climate mitigation and climate adaptation programs. And fourthly, it would impact peace building. But at this moment, the biggest impact we've registered is on the health, in the health sector, where there's a lot of concern around the healthcare workforce that in part had been sustained by a significant quantum of US funding. What the federal government of Nigeria has done is to initiate immediately remedial funding to resource a transition and essentially to fill the gap that would otherwise have been left by these funding cuts. So we have funding that is being rolled out now to absorb the human resources that would have been cut off or cut loose by the reduction in US funding. But we're also having now a wide-ranging conversation about how to insulate and build the resilience of our healthcare systems, given especially the idea that these funding cuts are not a short-term phenomenon. And I think given the trends that we're seeing elsewhere, it's not just been the US that has cut funding, but we know EU countries have cut funding as well. So we do not expect this to be a short-term phenomenon. We think that this is something that is going to be medium-term at least. So in that instance, there's a lot of thinking now going on around building the resilience of health systems and other systems to be able to withstand the impact of reduced external funding. So I would say that for us, those 4 areas are definitely critically impacted: the health sector, funding for climate mitigation and adaptation, climate funding for women's issues, gender justice issues, and for peace building. I would say those are 4 areas that we are looking at as having real critical impact based on this decision.
Thank you. Yeah, that is definitely something that will have very real life impacts and consequences.
Yeah.
Which is of course very worrying. And you're right. I think that this is a larger trend. I think we've even seen before the Trump presidency, European funding cuts, for example, in the Netherlands, out of political reasons when the government changed there. But we are now also seeing in governments such as the UK or Germany that basically funding is being allocated away from human security issues and humanitarian aid towards more conventional military spending for mostly with regards to the conflict in Ukraine and confronting Russian aggression. So I agree with you that this is coming and is intensifying. Would you say that also the peace building efforts in the northeast, the northwest of Nigeria, is that something that is also being directly affected? And would you actually say that the US, with you're saying in the paper that during the first Trump presidency there was mostly disinterest also towards Africa and also to a certain extent Nigeria. But nevertheless, the effort to try to stabilize and appease the conflicts in the northern areas between farmers and herders, especially, and other communities, is that something that will be now even more affected and actually roll back US influence in these areas, or is it something anyways that wasn't that relevant anymore and that you're dealing with mostly from the side of the Nigerian government and regional players, or maybe with the EU cooperation?
So potentially, where the impact would lie, some of the impact would be second order consequences. And what I mean by that is that some of the US funding was being channeled into ports, more general ports of funding controlled by, for example, the United Nations. So with regard to the Northeast, for example, where after about 15 years of an insurgency, the region is at the early stages of moving into a post-conflict situation. So obviously the issue of resettling internally displaced people, rebuilding conflict-impacted communities, restoration of civil authority, those issues with which the Nigerian authorities have been working closely with the UN would require some reassessment. Now, given the reduction of funding, into that pot, and of course, more generally, the UN's own, the new administration's own ambivalence towards the United Nations. So we would have to reassess that in terms of what resources are available to pursue those measures in the Northeast. When it comes to the North Central, there have been pockets of funding, yes, that have been affected by the withdrawals, but specifically those that were being directly funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development. So certainly there will be some impact there as well.
And is that something where you're already in conversations with partners in Europe? That's a bit. What are your expectations actually towards the German, but also the European nations at large in this new situation? Is that something where you say they should step in, or we should find new ways of collaboration and partnership? I mean, I'm seeing on your backdrop now in your room I think it's some of the SDGs, right, that are printed on that, and I have the impression at the moment the US is moved so far away from these references even of multilateral common values. They seem to be voting against any resolution that nowadays only mentions the term gender or SDGs or climate for that matter. So the question is really what kind of new alliances could be forged, right? And what should be the defining principles there?
Well,
It's an
I
open
think
question. I don't have any answers.
no problem. I think this is a time for considerable reflection. Something unprecedented is happening within the global development space. And so while we are trying to react in the moment, we're also looking at the long term, the medium term, and possibly the long term. So yes, we are constrained by the current issues to be creative and to broaden our parameters in the search for collaboration, to go to places where previously we had not always been interested in going to because we felt we had options closer home. But at the same time, there's a lot of in-house reflection to do in terms of how we define our programming, in terms of centering human security even more aggressively, and make it the real center, the central paradigm of development work, of how we respond to conflict, of peace building, of the entire spectrum of activities that we're engaged in. Previously, there was a lot of emphasis on almost episodic interventions. So if you have a 6-month activity, a 12-month activity, an 18-month activity. But now I think we are challenged to think a lot more creatively and a lot more long-term about the issues, and this will also affect how we design intervention programs. It will affect how we think of the entire development assistance landscape. And while we are always open to collaboration and partnership, we are not unaware of the pressures that European countries themselves have, obviously. Ukraine continues to be a major issue. Managing the influx of refugees from Ukraine will be a stressor for social infrastructure in Europe. So this requires us to be very aware of the world on a global scale. So while we are looking for collaboration and we remain open to collaboration, there's a lot of rethinking and reflection going on as well.
Thank you. And actually, there's a few questions now that I saw on the LinkedIn chat. And one of them is actually a good follow-up to this. You just now said the reflection and strategizing and framing of certain collaborations. And one of the questions here is from Sabine Muscat, who asks, could I ask whether you see a stronger potential EU role in the context of Nigeria's balancing act between the US and China, especially on digital cooperation? What are the risks both the EU and Nigeria need to consider? Is that something you want to respond to? I know it's a bit specific, but if you can, please be free.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely there's room for the EU. Obviously, this is a very specific ask in respect of digital cooperation. So that is perfectly fine. I think there is room, and there is always room, quite frankly, for anyone that wants to engage in productive, mutually beneficial collaboration with the Nigerian government. There is room. Digital cooperation, absolutely. I think there's a lot of room there. So that's a positive, yes, from me. I think in terms of, sorry, Simone, I didn't get the second question you asked.
The second one is actually, how does the current foreign policy of the US impact the cooperation within the AU, so the African Union?
Well, at this moment, I think there would be some, again, secondary impact. But speaking more broadly, I think one of the things we noticed from President Trump's first term in office was his own disinterest, quite frankly, in any sort of military engagements that would put US troops in harm's way in Africa, but elsewhere for uncertain strategic ends. So we could potentially see a rollback in cooperation on certain things, possibly potentially counterterrorism, for example. I think the main issue with the new administration is to limit the exposure of American troops in Africa and beyond, but also to ensure that there are very clear strategic and transactional objectives when American forces are being committed into situations. I think we'll still continue to see collaboration, some of the other forms of collaboration we've had. There's a lot of military to military assistance programs going on. I think that those will remain for the time being. But I think that, as I said earlier, we're just in a time where the defining attributes of American engagement with the world is that it has to be strategic and it has to be transactional. I think that those two things will continue to loom large.
Completely agree with you. And that's also something that the EU is trying to wrap its head around, I think, at the moment, of how to address those. Here's another question actually from our office director in Abuja, with a question on also the local discussion. So she asked, does US Congressman Scott Perry's statement that USAID supported terrorist groups like Boko Haram influence the discussion in Nigeria? And if so, how? I don't know if you're familiar with that statement. I'm not, but
yes.
Yeah, you are.
Yes. Congressman Scott Perry, I think this was 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, made some assertions to the effect that the U.S. Agency for International Development had been behind, essentially alleging that USAID had funded or had been engaged in funding terrorist activity here in Nigeria. So in terms of how it has affected public conversation, it does feed into some fringe anti-NGO sentiment. But of course, this is merely an allegation. I think the US Embassy here itself has responded assertively to that claim. There is no evidence at all that supports the assertions made by the congressman. In the short term, we would, of course, have to be concerned about the potential elevation of risk to humanitarian aid workers when somebody makes an allegation such as this. But I think that on the whole, common sense will prevail, and we recognize that there's no evidence whatsoever to back up these claims.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Yes, I think that these were all the questions now in the chat. Really, thank you, Chris, for answering them all. For now, I just wanted to quickly come back to the chapter you're writing about on countering China and BRICS, basically, because let's say, I think BRICS has been pretty clear in its effort to de-dollarize the international financial system, and to a certain extent already successfully so. And Trump, on the other hand, has been very clear about having a heavy hand on these kind of efforts. And as Nigeria is now not a member but a partner country of the BRICS, how would, if Trump really goes for, let's say, 100% customs on Nigerian goods and really drastically interfering with US-Nigerian trade in the commodity sector and other sectors, what would be your options? How would you basically balance such a situation? Because we're seeing really trade wars popping up all around us all the time. So it's not so unlikely, unfortunately.
Well, that's a really interesting hypothetical. But let me just say, I think, first of all, I think that de-dollarization is something that the BRICS countries, some of them may be interested in, but there's been no real consensus, that would lead to that as an immediate path of action or immediate course of action. What we've seen is a situation instead where trade between these countries has grown significantly. So, for example, with respect to the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs on Chinese goods and what the likely impact would be, it's important to note that much of China's trade, China has successfully diversified its trade over the last decade. It has tried to reduce its exposure to this type of measures by the United States. So much of China's trade is actually happening in Asia with the ASEAN countries, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. That's where a lot of its trade is happening. So the impact on China may not quite be as severe or as significant as it may be. However, trade wars will result in supply chain disruptions, which will inevitably affect everyone around the world. China is our biggest trading partner. So for us, weighing China being our biggest trading partner and the US, which as of last year was our 5th biggest trading partner, there would have to be trade-offs that we would have to think of. We would have to, think of what our options were or are, going forward, should such an eventuality arise. But, this is a hypothetical, so I can't go too much into the weeds on this. But I think that a lot will now depend, and I think going forward, what the new administration in the US has done is to trigger and accelerate conversations in other places, in other parts of the world about the necessity of regional integration, about the need for more trade, more regional trade. Obviously, in Africa, we're looking at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and we are asking ourselves as Africans now, how can we improve our trade volume? How can we accelerate trade relations in a way that is, mutually beneficial? Given what is happening with US policy. So I think that we will continue to see those kind of conversations going forward.
Interesting, yeah, and I think that is something also where the EU as a neighboring continent can come back into as well, and yeah, as also a large market that is still pro renewable energy and also the digital economy.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, in a different way. Actually, there was a follow-up question to this to the digital cooperation question, broadening it a bit to global gateway, more general. The EU. The EU's response to the Belt and Road Initiative and as a bigger funding mechanism, also for EU-African relations. Is that something that that there's hope for more engagement in Nigeria for such vehicles?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. As I said, we are open to mutually beneficial partnerships. We are very open to that, and our perspective is largely the more the merrier. As long as the partnership is mutually beneficial, we are perfectly fine with it. So there is a lot of room and willingness to engage in these and other matters.
And what would you tell the European audience? What has to improve? What has from the European side? What would you kind of advise these programs to improve and to better going forward now? Given the competitive context.
Yeah, I think if you look back over the last decade, and just looking back cursorily over the last decade, the kind of programming that the EU has been interested in, and then the kind of framing that the EU has been interested in, I think we have to say it would require much more diversity. So obviously, recognizing from the perspective of the EU, the vulnerabilities of the Mediterranean and the Sahel, and how irregular migration, irregular migration, counterterrorism, violent extremism in the Sahel, all of those things have been very significant determinants of EU programming. But it's important to stress that Africa is more than all of those things. Africa transcends those things. It's not just a place of danger and peril to Europe, you know. It's a place of immense opportunity. This is a continent that is one of the fastest growing in the world today, a dynamic young population in many places. As you pointed out, the market opportunities are there, they are huge. So I think we need much more imagination, as it were, in looking at the African opportunity, what I would call the African opportunity. It's not just about the problems, security related or problems around irregular migration. Yes, but we need to expand. We need to think much more about that. And I do think that human security as a paradigm offers us an interesting framework for thinking about that. Just the idea that economic security is fundamental to stability and all the other things we want to do in terms of building sustainable peace. For me, it's a very huge factor. That could change, and I'm hoping that that will sort of influence or broaden perspectives on the African opportunity. And I think since you cited the competitive context in which this is happening, I think that an argument could be made that the Chinese have been good at this. They've been, you know, stronger or, you know, or quicker, you know, off the bat in spotting opportunities and almost refusing to allow anything else get in the way of how they visualize opportunities. So I think that this would be an interesting way for the EU to broaden its horizons when it comes to the African opportunity. And I will add that unlike the US, which is separated from Africa by a vast ocean, the EU, Europe is right next door. I mean, historically, the relationships have always been clear. The Maghreb, the Mediterranean, that is the southern border of Europe. The relations have always been clear. Geography ordains it that way. So I think that the perspective on Africa that the EU would have would certainly be different from the perspective than a country in North America would have. I think there's an advantage in that proximity, and it's certainly one that the Europeans can take advantage of.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot. I really hope that these kind of exchanges that we're having now can be a little contribution in that regard, in both seeing opportunity and also sketching out some of the potential areas of cooperation there basically. And perhaps as a last point from my side, because I now, listening to you, I was very happy to hear that you were referring now to the north of Nigeria as for the first time in 15 years a post-conflict situation, that things are settling down. So I would be, of course, interested in just hearing from you very roughly, like what is needed there now? What kind of interventions are you also preparing with your office? How could there be a partnership in bringing post-conflict peace building, or let's say a peace stabilization efforts together there? That would be really interesting to see if there's new approaches to that end.
So I was speaking of the Northeast specifically,
okay.
You know,
Not
the
Northwest,
Northeast
right?
specifically, no, not the Northwest, but the Northeast specifically, whereas, you know, there's been an insurgency for around 15 years. But I am confident that we are entering a post-conflict phase. And there's been, over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen huge numbers of fighters and other conflict-impacted persons that have moved into the custody of the authorities. Now, we still have pockets where insurgents continue their activities, but I have to say, just in terms of the geography, those pockets are now limited areas. What we need now going forward is investment in programs that can guarantee a sustainable peace in these places. As you know, violence is, conflict itself is such a resilient phenomenon, largely because when you have insurgency or conflict of any kind over over a sustained period of time, it destroys livelihoods. And it just makes conflict reversion more possible. So what we need now are investments that can help us rebuild local economies. We need resources to restore civil authority in places and to resettle internally displaced persons as well as refugees, and essentially just to build viable local settlements, rebuild these economies. The phrase that our friends in the UN like to use is to build back better. So that is certainly what we want to do. We want to build societies better than the conflict met them. And in so doing, that would be our own guarantee, our own long-term guarantee against a revival, or a resurgence of that conflict. So those are the areas we're looking at: disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, rebuilding, reconstruction of communities, restoration of civil authority, supporting livelihoods and really bolstering local economies in a way that they can keep local talents and enable people self-actualize in their own homesteads. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Thank you, Chris. I think these are really good closing remarks, actually, and it sums it all up also well under our common roof of ensuring human security and focusing on the human security for all, especially in these areas. And thank you so much. This has been a really interesting exchange.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I hope, we can continue it at some time. I think we will definitely continue this series of talks, bringing in different perspectives and voices on up-to-date topics, and discussing them in a conversational chat. So thanks, Chris, for being our first guest here on this, and we'll stay in touch, and we'll share your really interesting paper on our networks. And all the best to Abuja.
Thank you very much, Simon. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
All the
best.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.